The Accidental President. Prologue, The Night of Shadows. Setting, United Nations Headquarters, New York City. The night was unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The imposing structure of the United Nations headquarters stood tall against the New York skyline, its windows glowing with the light of the evening summit. Inside, world leaders from nearly every nation had gathered, the discussions humming with the urgency of a world in crisis. Peace treaties, climate accords, and the resolution of conflicts were all on the agenda. But beneath the polished speeches and diplomatic pleasantries, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the assembly. In one of the conference rooms, the president of Nigeria, flanked by his top advisors, was deep in conversation with several African heads of state. They were discussing a new initiative for regional security, a plan that could bring lasting stability to a continent long plagued by conflict. The president's voice was steady, his tone optimistic, but there was a tension in his eyes that belied his words. He knew that the forces arrayed against this vision of peace were powerful and that they would not be easily overcome. Outside the conference room, the corridors of the UN were a bustle of activity. Diplomats, aides, and security personnel moved with purpose, the footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that something momentous was about to occur. But no one could have predicted just how momentous, or how dark, that something would be. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the first explosion rocked the building. It was a deafening roar, a violent shockwave that shattered windows and sent people crashing to the ground. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the building into darkness. Panic erupted as screams and shouts filled the air, the once orderly corridors now a chaotic jumble of bodies and debris. In the conference room, the president of Nigeria was thrown from his chair, his vision blurred by the impact. He struggled to his feet, his mind racing. What happened? Are we under attack? Before anyone could answer, a second explosion tore through the building, this one closer, more devastating. The walls trembled, the ceiling buckled, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke and burning materials. The president's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, searching for his advisors, for any sign of what was happening. But there was no time to think, no time to act. The door to the conference room burst open, and armed men in black tactical gear flooded in, the faces hidden behind masks. They moved with terrifying efficiency, the weapons trained on the president and his entourage. "Get down," one of the masked men barked, his voice cold and mechanical through his helmet. "Now." The president stared at the intruder, his mind reeling. "Who are you? What is the meaning of this?" But the man did not answer. He raised his rifle, and the last thing the president of Nigeria saw was the flash of the muzzle as the bullets tore through him. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of Nigeria, the presidential villa was shrouded in the stillness of night. The complex, a symbol of power and authority, was bathed in the soft glow of security lights, the silence broken only by the occasional murmur of guards on patrol. Inside, the president's closest advisors and senior military officers were gathered in the situation room, monitoring the progress of the summit. The villa had always been a place of intense activity, but tonight, there was a sense of foreboding that hung over the room like a dark cloud. The men and women present were seasoned professionals, accustomed to dealing with crises, but even they could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the secure line to New York went dead. The screens that had been displaying live feeds from the summit flickered, then went blank. A hushed silence fell over the room as the advisors exchanged worried glances. "Get me a line to New York," one of the military officers commanded, his voice taut with tension. "Now." But the lines remained silent. No response came from the other end. Panic began to creep into the room. The aides scrambled to restore communications, the fingers flying over keyboards, the voices rising in urgency. But it was no use. The connection to the UN was severed, and with it, any link to the president. Just then, the main door to the situation room swung open, and a man in full military uniform stepped inside. His presence was imposing, his face set in a mask of determination. It was General Adisa Kalu, one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Nigerian military. Kalu's arrival was met with a mixture of surprise and dread. He was not supposed to be here, he was supposed to be in Lagos, overseeing security operations. But the look in his eyes told them everything they needed to know. General Kalu, what is the meaning of this? One of the senior advisors demanded, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Kalu's gaze swept across the room, cold and calculating. The president is dead, he announced flatly, his words like a knife cutting through the air. So is the vice president. Most of the cabinet, too. There's no one left to lead this country. The shock was palpable, the air sucked out of the room in an instant. The advisors stared at Kalu, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Dead? How can that be? Another advisor stammered, his face pale. Kalu stepped forward, his voice taking on a steely edge. We are at war, gentlemen. Nigeria is under attack from within and without. And in times of war, we cannot afford weakness or hesitation. Effective immediately, I am assuming control of the government. Anyone who opposes me will be dealt with as an enemy of the state. The room erupted in protests and shouts, the advisors recoiling in horror at what they were hearing. But Kalu remained unfazed. He had planned for this moment, anticipated it for years. Now that it was here, nothing would stand in his way. The guards that had been stationed at the entrance of the situation room stepped forward, the weapons at the ready. It was a silent warning, a reminder of who held the power now. Kalu turned to the officers at his side, his orders clear and unwavering. Lock down the villa. Secure the military. No one leaves, no one enters without my authorization. Nigeria is mine now, and I will not tolerate dissent. As the guards moved to carry out his orders, Kalu allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The night of shadows had begun, and with it, the dawn of his reign. The country was his to mold, to shape, to control. And he would do so with an iron fist. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. The night sky over Abuja was dark and heavy with tension, as if the heavens themselves could sense the turmoil unfolding below. The presidential villa, usually a symbol of power and stability, was a fortress under siege. Inside, the nation's highest-ranking military officers and government officials gathered in a hastily convened emergency session, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. The situation was dire. Nigeria's president had been killed in a sudden and devastating attack that had left the country's leadership in disarray. The assassination had come without warning, a precise and calculated strike that had decapitated the nation's government in a single, brutal blow. Chaos reigned in the streets, and with no clear line of succession, the nation teetered on the brink of collapse. In the midst of this crisis, the country's top military officers convened in the secure command room deep within the villa. The room was filled with a palpable sense of dread as they faced the grim reality. Nigeria was on the verge of imploding, and there was no clear path to stabilize the situation. At the head of the table sat General Adisa Kalu, who had already begun to assume that he was in charge, being the highest-ranking officer in the Nigerian army alive. Kalu was a man known for his ruthlessness and ambition, and in the vacuum left by the president's death, he had quickly positioned himself as the most likely candidate to assume control. His cold, calculating gaze swept the room, assessing the officers around him, many of whom were already rallying behind him in hopes of restoring order. But not everyone in the room was ready to cede control to Kalu. Seated a few chairs away was Brigadier General Olatunji, a fierce loyalist to Kalu but with his own ideas about the country's future. While Kalu's ambitions were clear, Olatunji harbored doubts about whether Kalu's vision for Nigeria was the right path forward. As the senior officers debated fiercely over who should take control, Kalu's voice cut through the air, commanding attention. The nation needs strong leadership now more than ever, he declared. As the highest-ranking officer, it is my duty to assume the role of commander-in-chief and guide Nigeria through this crisis. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but it was clear that not everyone was convinced. Olatunji shifted uneasily in his seat, sensing that Kalu's ascendancy would lead Nigeria down a dangerous path. Yet, the alternative seemed unclear, until General Muhammad Musa, who was familiar with the Nigerian constitution, stood up and pointed out that there is a section of the constitution that says in the case where there's a military personnel who is among the cabinet members of the president, such an officer will become the acting president in a case of emergency. With all due respect, General Kalu, General Musa continued, his voice steady and calm, the president had a different vision for how this crisis should be handled. Kalu's eyes narrowed as he turned his gaze to the general. And what exactly are you suggesting, General Musa? He asked, his tone laced with barely concealed contempt. General Musa reached into his uniform and produced a sealed envelope, one bearing the unmistakable insignia of the President of Nigeria. The room fell silent as he placed the envelope on the table. Before his death, the President gave me this directive, to be opened only in the event of a national emergency such as this. The generals exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to expect. With a nod from the high-ranking officials present, General Musa broke the seal and began to read the contents aloud. The letter was brief but clear, written in the President's own hand. It outlined a contingency plan that had been carefully crafted in the event of a catastrophic leadership vacuum. The plan named Captain Joshua Odum as the acting commander-in-chief, with full authority to take command of the Nigerian armed forces and oversee the stabilization of the country. Gasps of shock echoed through the room. The idea that a captain, a relatively junior officer, would be placed above the highest-ranking generals was unprecedented. But the President's instructions were explicit. Odum was chosen for his clear-headedness, his understanding of Nigeria's complex socio-political landscape, and his incorruptible integrity. The President had entrusted him with the responsibility of leading the nation through its darkest hour. Captain Joshua Odum was not just an ordinary soldier, he was part of the President's inner circle, appointed as a member of the cabinet and as the President's personal assistant on security matters. His tactical brilliance, loyalty, and deep sense of duty had earned him the President's trust, a trust that would now shape the fate of the entire nation. At the moment, Captain Joshua Odum was on a special security assignment in the northern parts of Nigeria, far from the political turmoil that was unfolding in the capital. But with the President's directive now made public, he would soon be thrust into the center of the crisis. Kalu's face darkened with anger, but before he could speak, General Musa continued, "The President believed that in this moment of crisis, what Nigeria needs is not just a strong hand, but a steady one. Someone who can unite, rather than divide. Someone who will place the nation's interests above all else." The tension in the room was palpable. The generals knew that the President's directive carried the weight of law, and the Constitution must be followed. To challenge it would be to challenge the very principles they had sworn to protect. Kalu's fists clenched, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He had the loyalty of many of the officers in the room, and with a single order, he could seize power by force. But doing so would risk plunging Nigeria into even deeper chaos, something even Kalu could not afford. After what felt like an eternity, Kalu finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "If this is the President's will, then so be it. But know this, General Musa," he said, his eyes locking onto Musa's, "this will not be an easy path. The challenges you face will be immense, and not everyone will support Odum." General Musa met Kalu's gaze without flinching. "I understand the responsibility I've been given, and we are prepared to face whatever comes. But this is not about us. This is about Nigeria, about keeping our country from falling apart." With the President's directive now public, there was little the other officers could do but comply. Though many harbored doubts and reservations, they recognized the need for a unified command in this moment of crisis. Reluctantly, they acknowledged Captain Joshua Odum as the acting commander-in-chief of Nigeria. All the generals began making plans on how to get to Captain Joshua Odum and inform him about his current status as the acting president of Nigeria. Arrangements were made to bring Captain Odum to the presidential villa within 24 hours, ensuring that he could assume his new role without delay. Setting: a remote military outpost, northern Nigeria. Far from the chaos of Abuja, in the desolate reaches of northern Nigeria, Captain Joshua Odum was wrapping up another day at his remote military outpost. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert cloaked in darkness. Joshua stood alone outside the outpost, staring up at the star-studded sky, his mind quiet and at peace. This was the life he had chosen, far from the political intrigue of the capital, far from the corruption that plagued so many of his peers. Here, in the barren expanse of the north, he could be a soldier, nothing more and nothing less. It was a simple life, but it was one that suited him. But even in this remote outpost, the shadows of the night would soon find him.